And welcome to the January 2022. Happy New Year, everybody. Our planetarian Zoom seminar. Today, we have Tony Smith. He's from the Bishop Planetarium in Honolulu, Hawaii, and he's going to be talking about navigating by the stars. And without further ado, Tony.
Hey, thanks, Alan. Aloha, everyone. Thank you all so much for showing up today. I like to attend these pretty regularly, so it's fun to get the chance to be the presenter as well. Like Alan said, I'll be talking about celestial non-instrument traditional navigation, and mostly in Hawaii, but also how that kind of has spread through revival in the rest of the Pacific as well. I have about 15-20 minutes or so, some slides, and then I'm going to turn Stellarium on, and we're going to do some just kind of quick demos to kind of look at some of the stuff that that we did here.
Tony, can I ask a question?
Yeah, sure.
The question is, do you mind people asking questions during your presentation?
Oh, no, not at all. Yeah, that's totally fine.
Okay,
that
so stay muted,
stay
muted, everybody, unless you want to ask a question.
Yeah, and I don't think that with the windows and stuff that I've got that I can see everybody. So Alan, maybe if you're able to,
I'll monitor the chat.
A hand raised or in the chat.
Yeah. Okay.
And then it may work a little bit better with things if you have some questions queued up, and then I'll give some pauses and see where we can where I can come back to questions. So I will show you my slides. Okay, so can see that okay?
It's okay.
Okay, awesome. And can still hear me and everything all right too? Great.
Coming through loud and clear.
Okay, awesome. And I will just note, our museum does have a mask policy still in place. So since I'm here in the office, I will be wearing my mask. So I'll try to speak up and make sure that you guys can hear me okay. But if something happens, just let me know, and I can happy to repeat myself too. So I am Tony Smith. I'm the planetarium supervisor at the Waitangi Planetarium here at Bishop Museum in Honolulu. I've been here for about 3.5 years, which is also how long I have worked in planetariums. So I worked in museums and science education and formal science education for about 10 years though. So far working in a planetarium, I think, has been my favorite part. We're gonna talk about navigating by the stars today. I will point out that I am neither Native Hawaiian nor am I a navigator. This is knowledge that has been shared with me by other folks. So I am pleased to be able to share it with you as well. Some of you may have received at some point in your planetarium career a show called The Explorers of Polynesia, or maybe Journey by Starlight. So there's some kind of other things that are out there that our museum has produced. So let me get to here. So just a little bit quickly about our planetarium. We just celebrated our 60th birthday this past December. So December 12th, 1961, the day that we opened. We were the second planetarium in Polynesia, almost the first, beat out by just a couple of years by one that was in Aotearoa in New Zealand. But they closed in the 80s, so we get to say that we are the longest continuously operating planetarium in Polynesia. And to define Polynesia, that is Hawaii in the north, Rapa Nui or Easter Island in the southeast, and Aotearoa or New Zealand in the southwest. Our planetarium was called Kilolani for the first 25 years. That name means observing the heavens. And we've been the Waitangi Planetarium since the Waitangi family provided a donation in 2003 for a pretty massive interior renovation. We have 64 seats under a 9-meter dome, and we're a Digistar 6 system hybridized with a Goto Kronos 2 optical star projector. Our museum was founded in 1889 by Charles Reed Bishop, who was an American who married Princess Bernice Pauahi Bishop, who was the last direct descendant of the royal Kamehameha family. And our mission is to inspire a community and visitors through the exploration, celebration, and perpetuation of the extraordinary history, culture, and environment of Hawaii and the Pacific. So we do quite a lot here. So for voyaging in the Pacific, just some background and context before we come to Hawaii. People sailed out of Southeast Asia and out into the Pacific, populating islands as they went, starting somewhere around 5,000 years ago. They found thousands of islands, and they spread, eventually reaching as far as Hawaii in the north, Rapa Nui or Easter Island in the southeast, and Aotearoa, New Zealand in the southwest. With that, they used knowledge of the stars, ocean swells, and patterns, as well as other signs from the natural world around them, such as clouds and birds or other animals. Oral traditions and more recently archaeological evidence has told us that migrations were intentional and not accidental. So if anybody has heard of Thor Heyerdahl and his thinking that people on rafts just happened to blow to the west across the Pacific, that has long been disproven and discredited. So we know at this point that people did this on purpose. In Hawaii specifically, permanent settlement was established around 1000 to 1100 CE. The long ocean crossing voyages between Hawaii and other places in the Pacific like Tahiti appear to have ceased around 1400. And there was no written language. So once the voyaging stopped, there was no reason to keep passing that knowledge down. And so a lot of it was lost and only kind of faded into myth and legend over the next several hundred years. Fast forwarding into the 1970s, the Hawaiian Renaissance period, partially spurred by the Hokulea and the resurgence of navigation in Hawaii. So after over 100 years of cultural suppression after the arrival of Christian missionaries in the 1820s, also the sovereign Hawaiian kingdom was illegally overthrown in 1893 by American businessmen who wanted annexation to the United States, which is a fact that is not very widely known outside of Hawaii. Even to this day, technically Hawaii is an illegally occupied territory, not even a territory of the US either. It's a sovereign kingdom. But here we are today. There also followed systemic oppression of Native Hawaiians in their own lands, decimated by diseases and many other things. The Hawaiian Renaissance kind of coincided with other cultural movements growing in the 1960s. And here in Hawaii, things that were experienced of resurgence, cultural practices like lo'ikalo, which is farming, kind of specifically of taro patches, olelo Hawaii, the spoken Hawaiian language, hula, malama aina, or caring for the land, as well as traditional wayfinding. So all of those things kind of all together really sparked what was going on with the Hawaiian Renaissance. The Polynesian Voyaging Society was formed and founded in 1973 by anthropologist Ben Finney, sailor Tommy Holmes, and artist Herb Kane. They wanted to determine if people could have intentionally voyaged to new islands. So that was still in question at the time. A lot of folks thought that they had just kind of by accident been blown around, but they wanted to see if the stories that had been passed down about intentional voyaging could be proven more scientifically. The first task was to build a replica double-hulled voyaging va'a or canoe. And so they did the best that they could. They did not really use many traditional materials for building hokulea. It is a lot of fiberglass and more modern kind of sails and ropes and things. They named hokulea after Arcturus, which the star in Hawaii is called Hokulea, which means the star of joy. It was finished in 1975. The biggest problem, now that they had their va'a, their canoe, was that nobody knew how to navigate it without instruments in the traditional way, because as I had said, that knowledge had mostly died out. So they found this man, Mano Piluke, who is one of the last traditional wayfinders in the Pacific. He is from the island of Satawal in Yap State in Micronesia, many thousand miles to the west of Hawaii. But knowing that the wayfinding way of life was disappearing forever, he agreed to help. And this was a really, really big step because for his culture, it's kind of a sacred thing to become a wayfinder and a navigator. And it was not allowed to share that with outside of your own community, let alone outside of your own culture and across the world. But kind of seeing the effects of globalism and the way that things were moving through history and colonialism and everything else that had gone on and was wiping out this way of life, he thought he needed to help. And so he, in 1976, navigated Hokulea 2,500 miles from Hawaii to Tahiti using only the natural world around him. which is particularly significant because he was not from this area and he had never sailed around Hawaii or never sailed down to Tahiti. And so he had to kind of learn a little bit about what things were going to be like. So when he came to Hawaii, he actually, they brought him into the planetarium. And stories that I've heard from those first couple of visits was that he hated the planetarium and asked to leave almost immediately after the stars came on. And one person had told me that he even said that, like, this is wrong. This is not the way that it actually is. And they're not entirely sure what he had meant by that, but it's possible that his vision was bad and so he couldn't actually see it very well, or because everything is sort of scaled down and all the stars are all closer together, then that was throwing him off. In any case, he didn't like the planetarium. And so did everything outside. So in that 1976 voyage, the return trip back to Hawaii, Nainoa Thompson was one of the crew members and was inspired by Mao's ability and wanted to learn for himself. Today, Nainoa Thompson is the president of Polynesian Voyaging Society and one of only a few navigators to have been inducted into the PO rank of navigator, which in Micronesian culture where Mano Piluke was from, there's several different kind of ranks of navigator, and PO is one of those that really kind of shows mastery of the craft. And so he's one of only a handful of outsiders to ever be inducted into that. So that's where he is today. But back in the late 70s, he was trying to learn this stuff himself. So he was, kind of taking some classes and trying to learn from books as well as he could. But he was puzzled particularly by the moon rising in a different point on the horizon than the sun. As far as he knew, the moon and the sun should rise from the exact same point on the horizon. So he called the planetarium here at Bishop Museum and was invited to meet with Will Kaselka, who was a lecturer here at the time. And after answering Nainoa's initial question, he was about to leave. Nainoa definitely had a lot more questions that he wanted to ask, but he didn't want to impose on Will's time. And Will sort of sensed this and invited him to come back. And that sparked what became hundreds and hundreds of hours spent together, both in the planetarium, outside, on boats, bribing the security guards at the museum with plate lunch to let them stay overnight to spend more time in the planetarium. And then in 1978, when they were set to begin their first voyage, Hokulea capsized off of the island of Lanai. And after 12 hours with no rescue, lifeguard and champion big wave surfer Eddie Aikau paddled away on his surfboard towards land, which was some 15 miles away, and he was never seen again. The crew was eventually rescued, and once they had learned what happened to Eddie, or that they didn't know what happened to Eddie, they resolved to finish what they had started in Eddie's honor. So this really was a very tragic event, but also then spurred a lot of other, really recommitting to the idea and making sure, like, you have a reason to make sure you do this now. Otherwise, Eddie has been lost in vain. So they still needed help with navigation. And so Nainoa went to Sadawal and convinced Mao to help them, and then started training under him. Then in 1980, Nainoa successfully navigated to Tahiti without modern instruments, becoming the first Hawaiian to do so in 600 years. So I'm going to take just a moment to look at the chat and see if there were any questions that anybody had. And cool. Okay. So kind of over the next 40 years after that voyage in 1980 up until today, this is kind of a rough timeline of some of the major voyages that they've taken. In the mid-80s, the Hokulea and crew went around Polynesia, inspiring others along their way in Tahiti and Aotearoa, New Zealand in particular. New voyaging movements were started there as well, because similar to Hawaii, those folks had lost their knowledge of how to do that. And in 1999, they sailed out to Rapa Nui, to Easter Island, which is a very, very small target, very, very far away, but they managed to get there. In 2014 to 17 was their biggest undertaking to that point, where they sailed all the way around the world, taking about 3 years to do so. So they left Hawaii in 2014, and they didn't come back until 2017. there were, various crews along the way. I think something like 50 different crew members, about 30 different legs of the journey that they took. And some people stayed longer than others and, went in and out. But Hokulea and itself took that long to go all the way around. They had been planning their next voyage for this coming spring in just a couple of months, the Moana Nui Akea voyage. And that's was set to start in Alaska and then go around the Pacific Rim. But because of COVID, they have, I just heard they are postponing that until 2023. So hopefully they'll be able to get going on that as they go. And one thing that I'll note is throughout all of these voyages, our planetarium has maintained that connection with Polynesian Voyaging Society and continue to make sure that we're a place that's available for them to continue practicing and training the next generation of navigators. We have a couple of programs for the public that we do with navigators from Hokulea that we have pivoted to online during the pandemic, but have been very popular up until that point. So that's kind of some of the background and some context for navigation and the basics of modern wayfinding. We'll go into a little bit of that at this point. We're going to focus on mostly how you use the stars, but it's important to note that the techniques that are used today are a mixture of modern innovations and Maupiailuke's teachings. This is not necessarily how early Hawaiians and early Polynesians had voyaged and navigated long voyages. Probably pretty similar, but we don't know for sure. These techniques are also varying between navigators as well as between cultures. So there's not kind of one specific, this is the way, because of the way that it's gone, it varies quite a lot. Many of the names of celestial objects used today are modern as well, although some of them are traditional. So as I had mentioned before, there has been quite a lot of suppression of Hawaiian culture, even here in Hawaii. And so a lot of the knowledge has been lost. So some places some names had persisted through time, but a lot of it, they had to give new names. And it kind of matches up a little bit with what we use for like scientific astronomy and the IAU designations of things, but not exactly one-to-one. So that's important to note as well. So the Polynesian Voyaging Society, along with University of Hawaii scholars and others, had worked to identify what they could from stories and chants that had been recorded or that had continued to be passed down orally, as well as the texts that were written in the 19th century, which became the first recordings of Hawaiian knowledge in writing. So wayfinding is a term that really refers to multi-sensory techniques. So feeling the movements of the ocean, observing the positions of the stars, observing the conditions of the weather and clouds, as well as looking for clues from animal life. So it's all of these things all together refers to wayfinding. What we talk about in our planetarium and what I'll kind of go over for the rest of this talk is what is used just with the stars. But just keep in mind that the stars are only a small component of the whole wayfinding art and science. We're going to break it into these kind of 5 components: the Hawaiian star lines, the Hawaiian star compass, meridian pointer stars, the sun and the moon, as well as determining latitude. So the Hawaiian star lines were developed by University of Hawaii scholars. These are kind of like mega constellations. There's 4 of them that run north to south across the sky. They're roughly aligned with the seasons. And again, that's kind of because they sort of took this, what they wanted to use and built it around the framework that already existed with the dominant Western culture here. And so that means most of the Greek and Roman constellations that a lot of us are very familiar with, so that they kind of align with the seasons following those. 3 of the 4 of the star lines can be seen over the course of any night. The stars and their locations relative to each other, they memorize all of those stars so that even if a small portion of the line is visible because of clouds or sea spray or whatever else there is the problem, they can see a small other part, then they can reconstruct in their mind some of the positions of the other stars. They have to memorize something like 200 plus different stars and their positions. So it's a lot of memorization and a lot of work. So the star lines are a way to organize them a little bit more and help with that. So the 4 Hawaiian star lines, the one that we'll start with is called Manaya Kalani, which means the chief's fish line. And this includes the stars of the summer triangle, Sagittarius and Scorpius. The triangle becomes the sail of a va'a, and also some can represent the Polynesian triangle. Sagittarius teapot, part of it, kind of becomes the fish pimoe, which is in some stories the fish that Maui, the demigod, pulled out of the ocean that became the islands using his magic hook. And then Scorpius is not a scorpion because those animals were not known in this part of the world until after the arrival of Westerners, but it is a fish hook instead. So Kamaka Nui on Maui is Maui's big magic fish hook. So that's the one that he used to pull the islands up out of the sea. And Maui, as well as his fish hook, shows up in stories in many different Polynesian cultures, including Hawaii. Kalupe Acavelo is the kite of Kavelo. He was a great ali'i of the island of Kauai, whose kite flying prowess as a child foretold of his greatness as a leader later in life, which eventually did prove to be true. Each star in the square, which this kind of roughly follows the square of Pegasus. Each star in the square is named for a great ali'i of a different island. And Cassiopeia is Iwa Keli'i, the great frigate bird. So rather than trying to figure out how that's meant to be somebody sitting in a chair, Cassiopeia, if you imagine seeing a big bird far away, you get kind of that W or M shape of their wings, and that is what frigate birds look like, or Iwa birds look like when they're far away. Kekau Makalii, this is the one that we see in our sky right now because it surrounds Orion and the winter circle. A ka is a canoe bailer, so something that you would use to scoop water out of your canoe if you're taking on water at sea. The picture that we use in the planetarium there looks a little bit like an ice scooper, but that's the idea, is you scoop it out. One element of this that I really enjoy is that Capella and the constellation we know as Auriga is called Hokule. That refers to both the star of Capella as well as the entire circle. Is Hokule, which Hoku means star, and lei, most people know what a lei is, right? The flower things that you wear around your neck are made of other stuff too. So Hokule makes way more sense because it's a lei of stars as opposed to a guy holding a baby goat. Sirius is called A'a, which means fire or burning brightly. And A'a is also one of the two main types of lava. So A'a and Pahoehoe, both of those are Hawaiian words for two main types of lava that are used in geology all over the world, not just in Hawaii. But it's a great name for the brightest star in our sky. It also happens to be the zenith star for Tahiti. So the zenith star being the one that when it reaches its highest point in its path across the sky, if you're standing at that latitude, then that's what you see overhead. So when you're in Tahiti, you see Sirius go directly overhead. Orion is Kahehe Onakiki, which is the cat's cradle or the string game of the children. And string games are traditionally used in the Pacific for telling stories, including here in Hawaii. The Pleiades is Makalii, which means the tiny eyes, or sometimes might be the eyes of the chief, depending on what translation you use, and is a very important set of stars to observe in the Hawaiian calendar, because combined with lunar phases, it is used to determine the start of the Makahiki season, which is a time where there's a kapu or a ban on war and fighting, and instead there's peace, there's games, there's competitions, kind of some harvest time and making ready for the new year. As it rises when the sun goes down, it also is a way that you know that the weather patterns are about to change. So we go from the hot, dry season of Kau into the cooler summer, wetter season of Ho'oilo, which are the only two seasons that we have in Hawaii, hot and dry and cool and wet. And they are not even that different from each other, but it's what we have. So Makalii is important for that. And then finally, Ka'iwi Kuamoto literally means the lizard's backbone, but it's intended more figuratively to be like links in a chain of knowledge. So this follows a path from the North Star, which is Hoku Pa'a, the stationary star, through the Big Dipper, which means Nahiku, the seven, arcing down to Arcturus, or Hokulea, the star of joy. Hokulea is the zenith star for Hawaii, so we see it directly overhead when it reaches its highest point in the sky. And for voyagers, after a long voyage, you see it directly overhead or close to overhead. It makes you happy because it means you're almost home. Spica is Hikianalia. There's no direct translation for it, but it is known as a navigation star. And then you go through Corvus, or Me'e as it's called in Hawaii, and then drop down to the Southern Cross, which is Hanaya Kamalama, which means cared for by the moon. So this one is one of my favorites because it just follows a very good path all the way from the North Star all the way down to the Southern Cross across the whole sky. Another tool that's used is the Hawaiian star compass. This is a mental construct. So this is not something that is physical that you would hold in front of you. It's Nainoa Thompson's invention. It's based off of Mau Piluke's Micronesian star compass, where for Micronesia, it was specific to the stars rising and setting points there, where within the region that he would be sailing, you need the stars because you can't see the islands for where you need to go, but you're not really changing latitudes a whole lot for what Mau did, where he was from. And so his star compass was unevenly spaced because it was, each house was named for the star that lived there, that was that would rise from that house. In the one that Nainoa Thompson came up with, it's useful over any latitude, or most any latitudes. It's really the best between the tropics, or between like 45 north and south. And then once you get too far north, things start to get really tricky, north or south. But the horizon is broken into these 32 equally spaced hale, or houses. The cardinal directions, northwest, southeast, are Aikau, Komohana, Hema, and Hikina. And it's mirrored from east to west. So if you look at it, you'll notice that those names appear on both halves of that circle representing the horizon. The navigators will memorize the house that a star lives in and how that changes with the latitude that you'll be changing over the course of your voyage. This is a way to find directions by using the stars, the sun, the moon, when they're rising or setting. So before a voyage, modern navigators can learn what houses they're looking at stars in. Once they're on the voyaging canoe, they don't use any traditional method, or they don't use any modern navigation techniques. They only use their traditional ones, but as they're preparing, they definitely use as much technology and other things as they can. Like I said, including our planetarium, but they use stellarium quite a lot too for their training. So that's the star compass. So measuring latitude is another kind of tricky part, or not tricky part, but part that goes into it. So the easiest way to do it is Hokupa'a, or the North Star, which kind of is the easiest if you can see it. Its distance above the horizon tells you your latitude. There are a couple of problems with this, though. Specifically in Hawaii, we're 21 degrees. Honolulu is 21 degrees. The south point of the Big Island, the southern part of the island chain, is 19 degrees. And then the north shore of Kauai, which is as far north you go in the islands, that's about 22 degrees. So you can it's close enough that everything works pretty well throughout the islands. 21 degrees or 20 degrees also happens to be the span of the average adult's shaka. So if you put your pinky on the horizon and your thumb up into the air, then right at your thumb should be the North Star. So if you're holding that at arm's length, your hand span of your shaka is about 20 degrees for most adults. You can't rely on just one thing, though, for two reasons. One of those is that it's cloudy a lot of the time. And so you can't always rely on seeing specific stars. And Hokupa'a Polaris is only visible in the northern hemisphere. And actually all of Polynesia, except Hawaii, is in the southern hemisphere. So you need more than one way to do this. So that's why all of these different pieces coming together. Meridian pointers are pairs of stars that are known to line up when they pass through the meridian, pointing to the northern horizon or the southern horizon. So these are really important for finding directions. They can also be used to determine latitude. If you know a star's altitude at a given latitude, and you know when a star is in the meridian, then you can measure the altitude with your hand and estimate your latitude. The closer that a star is to the horizon, the more accurately its altitude can be measured without instruments. And stars that cross the meridian too close to the horizon, though, and kind of in general, if they're too close to the horizon, you can't see them because of clouds on the horizon or sea spray, or things like that. Crux is a very, very important measuring stick. When it's standing upright in the meridian, the distance between the top and bottom stars, which is about 6 degrees, is the same as the bottom star to the horizon when you see it from Hawaii. This is an important measuring stick for voyagers coming back home, because in Tahiti, the Southern Cross is very, very high up into the sky, or as you go south and in the Southern Hemisphere. If you're in the Southern Hemisphere, then you know how high up it gets. But in Tahiti specifically, it's pretty far up into the sky. So as you're coming back to Hawaii from there, they watch it as it comes closer to the horizon. And then when that measurement of the top to bottom star equals bottom to the horizon, then they know that they can sail for home. And they will intentionally sail too far to the east of their islands because the winds come from the east. And so if they're too far to the east, but they get to the right latitude, then they just get blown into the islands essentially. Or they can start looking for signs from birds or other animals, and changes in currents, cloud patterns, and then eventually seeing the mountains of the Big Island rising above the horizon. Pairs of rising and setting stars are also important. So key pairs of stars are known to rise or set at the same time at different latitudes. So for example, from our latitudes in Hawaii, Hokulea and Hikianalia, or Arcturus and Spica, they rise at the same time. And Puanakau and Kapuahi, or Rigel and Aldebaran, set at the same time, as you see them from Hawaii's latitudes. And a navigator will memorize rising and setting pairs for different latitudes along their journey. Another example of these is in Tahiti, Sirius and Pollux will set at the same time. So depending on your latitude, you got different rising and setting pairs of stars. And then Zenith Stars is something else that can't be relied on too much because canoes pitch and roll so much on the ocean. And so it's really hard to figure out when a star is directly overhead. But different latitudes have different stars that pass directly overhead through the zenith point as they cross the sky. As I mentioned, Hokulea is the zenith star for Hawaii, and Sirius or A'a is the zenith star for Tahiti. Technically, Arcturus is 19 degrees above the horizon, but it's close enough that it works for all of Hawaii. And then that kind of brings us to the end of what I've got prepared for you folks. So just wrapping things up, this is a super complicated process that requires constant observations, many changing signs, which means that navigators sleep very, very little. Their training does continue today in our planetarium, and it is our kuleana or our responsibility to tell their stories and use it to inspire others that honors that long history. And then just as a very small plug, our planetarium does have a full dome program, Wayfinders, Waves, Winds, and Stars, that's available for licensing through ENS Spitz, as well as K2 and Loch Ness. And then Loch Ness has short-term rentals of it available too. So it's kind of stands alone as a 25-minute film, but it also is intended to be broken into 4 chunks with some live interactive sections, 3 of those to build the audience up to a final journey to Tahiti, and then they determine when you're back in the right latitude for Hawaii. So let me know if you're interested in that or look in those distributors. And I will see if there's any questions at this point, or you can feel free to email me, tony.smith@bishopmuseum.org. And I'll see if there's any questions at the moment, and then we'll switch over to Stellarium, and I'll show you a couple of those things for the stars. But at the moment, I'm going to stop sharing my presentation.
Thanks, Tony. That was really great. That's great. Hey, everybody, if you want to unmute, you could give them a round of applause here.
Well done, Tony.
Yeah.
Mahalo. Appreciate it.
Tony, this is Ken Miller. If I can add a thing.
Yeah, please do.
Some of you folks are aware that the Explorers of Polynesia show came out as part of the Explorers Project 25, 27 years ago. I forget exactly what. It was a slide-based program. It was in 3 parts with 2 breaks in the middle for interactive parts, measuring the height of the North Star and so on. I know that a lot of those programs are out there still. A lot of them are now in cardboard boxes as people have gone to full dome video or whatever. But it's worth taking a look at some of that programming as well as there was a binder of activities and such that came out with it. If you're interested in some of this, you might want to drag some of that material back up, take a look at it. There are also soundtracks and all that sort of thing that are freely shared. That was a NASA produced, NASA sponsored program, so that if any of you have it and want to share it with somebody else, go for it. Totally copyright free and encouraged to spread around the world. I've seen that shown done and participated in doing that show everywhere from Japan to Denmark. So please use that program and its materials as you will.
What was that called again?
That's Explorers of Polynesia from the Explorers Project from Bishop Museum 20 some years ago.
Great.
Tony, can you explain a little bit more about the meridian stars?
Mhm.
There's an issue, as you alluded to, of telling where straight up is.
Yeah.
So yeah, maybe we can identify north and south points from various star rotations, but how do you know when something's passing the meridian? How do you know where the zenith is?
Yeah. So a lot of that comes from the preparation before they go on their voyage. So they know which stars to be looking for, and they can figure out the time as well. And so for time, I always forget whether or not they actually use watches. I don't think that they do, but they have other ways of telling time. Specifically, when they can see it, the Little Dipper kind of swings around the North Star, kind of like a clock, and so they can get a rough estimate of their time, kind of that way. They also, like I said, through that preparation, so they kind of know which stars they're looking for to be more or less on top of each other. So that's not something I'm super familiar with. I just started learning a little bit more about those meridian pointers a little more recently. So the Polynesian Voyaging Society website has a lot of resources and stuff on there too that would probably do a better job of answering that. But yeah, like you said, it is difficult to determine straight above your head. I imagine on the horizon it might be a little bit easier to see when the stars that you're looking for specifically for what latitude you know that you're at are above and below each other, as opposed to still being kind of at an angle.
All right. One of the things that one of the navigators, it wasn't Nainoa, it was one of his disciples, if you will, talked to me about in terms of zenith, was that the mast of a canoe is not necessarily vertical by any means. Okay, it's generally canted backwards towards the stern of the canoe. But this navigator told me that, well, if you take a plumb bob, take a piece of string down to the deck of the canoe, as long as the rest of the rigging stays fixed, as long as the mast is still where it is, and of course everything stretches and moves as the canoe moves, but basically they can tell a point on the deck of the canoe that if they sight past the top of the mast should be the zenith. Of course, that's done at dock in calm water. Out in the ocean, everything's moving around all over the place, and so you don't know where it is. But he says, but you know what? Generally, there's a figure eight pattern in the sky, and at the intersection of that figure eight, pretty close to the zenith. So I've never tried it myself, have not been that much of a sailor, but it's an interesting concept to try to figure out where the zenith might be and then try to paint that line across the sky that we can do so easily in our planetariums.
Yeah, that's interesting. I know there's some stories that talk about a calabash, or like a big gourd full of water with holes drilled in it as well, that has been pretty hard to like duplicate scientifically, and none of those gourds are known actually to exist. There's one somewhere in our collections I've heard that is supposed to be one that belonged to King David Kalakaua, but the use of it is not known because I don't know, people just they don't know for sure.
Yeah, there's so much of that. They talk about this gourd cut in half basically, and you can see the reflection of a star off of the water. Mm-hmm. And might match it up with holes drilled in the side of the gourd. Mm-hmm. There's so much of this story that you'd really like to go back 1,000 years and see how much is BS and how much is true, and how much is people second guessing after the fact. But the main fact is that it works. They can sail around the Pacific using current techniques that are probably similar to the ancient techniques, and nail those islands every time. Not one of these voyages of the Hokulea or the subsequent canoes has wandered off and had their sailors die.
Yeah.
They all managed to do it somehow and without modern technology.
Yeah, and I think something I didn't mention because it has more to do with sailing is that it's not exact, right? For scientific purposes and things, you want to try to be exact, and for a lot of our training, like that's you have to be exact. But for what they're doing, close enough is good enough in most cases. And they have a target area, an imaginary target area that's kind of a certain radius around an island that they expect to hit and that they're aiming for. So not exactly hitting the island, because these islands that they're going to are all relatively small, and some of them actually very small. And so they have kind of just an area of their mental map that they're kind of getting to. And once you're within that circle, then you can figure out, there's birds that will fly out a couple 100 miles to eat during the day, and then they'll fly back at night with their fish, and then go back to feed their babies or to roost at night or something. So getting within a certain area is really good enough, and then they can look for those other signs that lead them the rest of the way. There was a question in the chat too. Yeah, go ahead, Ken.
Do not follow Albatross home to an island. They sail out, they fly out from their nesting spots and can be at sea for 2 or 3 years before they come back, but follow
right, yeah.
terns and other birds that are just day trippers out and back.
Yeah, so knowing the right birds to follow is definitely important. So the question that I saw was, how do they determine longitude? And they're not determining longitude as a measurement exactly. One of the things they do in preparation is they set their reference course for where they're wanting to go, and then as they're sailing, they're keeping track of their direction that they're traveling as well as their speed. And then they are using dead reckoning techniques to then compare that with where they think they should be compared with where they've been, as well as where they think they should be along their reference line. And if you look at maps from their various journeys, you can see that how close they stay to their reference line. The reference line is obviously really straight, and they're kind of like, zigzagging and wiggling a little bit along it, or they get down here and they realize, oh shoot, we're off, and then they get over. And so it's not determining longitude exactly, but it's kind of dead reckoning that position. Yeah.
As I recall from our Journey by Starlight show, they would aim in dead reckoning. They would aim sort of towards the east of the island if the prevailing winds were from the east. So they would aim, right. Yeah. And so they would end up at the right latitude and then just sail in with the wind.
Yeah, that's exactly what Amy had said in the chat as well. So for Hawaii, when you're coming back from Tahiti, you're watching the Southern Cross get low, but your reference course will take you too far to the east of Hawaii. And then once you get that measurement right with the Southern Cross, you know that you're at the right latitudes, and then you can just point yourself west and just essentially sail until you run into the islands, basically. And then where you get close enough, then you can figure out where they are. And if you can find one of the Hawaiian islands, you can find the other ones as well. So
that's what Amy says in the chat is called run their eastings down.
Yeah.
I didn't know what that meant, but
yep. Yeah, another point that many of the navigators would talk with me as I tried to pick their brains, as I know Tony's doing now too, was, okay, so it's daytime, it's overcast, it's cloudy, you can't even really tell where the sun is for sure. And you're sailing for 12 hours, 18 hours. Wait a minute, it's going to be cloudy that night too, and the next night, and the next night, and the next day. So you're going to be sailing for 2, 3, 4 days with no real navigation clues from the sky. Then what? And at that point, Nainoa and others would say, well, you sit tight. Literally, you sit on the tail, one of the 2 tails of the catamaran canoe. There's an observer station there that has a backrest and a seat, and he locks himself in there and sits tight and feels the canoe move. And basically, as he's seeing the stars, he realizes where the wave fronts are coming from. It could be left, forward, left, right, back. There are 2 or 3 or 4 wave motions all intersecting across the ocean at any one time. And so he realizes that the storms that are causing those waves hundreds of miles away are probably not going to change in an hour or two, and in fact, maybe not even in a day or two. So they're going to be sending those waves from the forward right, and another storm way off in Antarctica is sending one from south and to the left, and so on. And so he notices that rock and roll, 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 rock, 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 roll, whatever it is that the canoe's doing. And if he would manage to move the canoe off of that heading, a rock, rock, roll turns into a roll, rock, rock, roll, or something different, a different feel on his body as he's sitting braced into that backrest in the navigator's position, and he'll bring it back until he feels that same motion that he felt the last time he saw the stars. And so that'll get him from one day to the next, and if necessary, to the next and to the next. And as Tony said, navigators don't sleep. They may rest, they may go into a who knows whatever it is, REM state or whatever for a few minutes now and then, but they need to keep that connection with the ocean and the motion of the ocean to do their job. It's pretty phenomenal, really.
Yeah, thanks, Ken. That's one of the other things that does come up a lot when we talk about this is, we kind of, for our planetarium programming, we really kind of focus on the sky and the star aspect of it. But yeah, there's all of those other pieces that go into it as well that, it's as much an art as it is a science. And all of this is built on trial and error, right? Like that's really the only way that people were able to get around. Another question we get a lot is like how people came to Hawaii in the first place, because the winds don't blow you this way. And that's still a little bit up for debate. But there are some ideas that, people had always known that as they keep going, they will find more islands. And the more desperate you get, whatever famine that you're experiencing on your current island or whatever else, threats from other people, you're willing to go farther and farther to check. And so they might prepare themselves for, a 2-week voyage. You go out for a week, you don't find anything, you come back. And then maybe next time you prepare for 3 weeks and you kind of get ready that way. And then eventually, if you find something, that's great. And once you have found something, you can find your way back and get there again. So people weren't trying to get to Hawaii necessarily, but they had always known that as they're exploring, they always find more islands. So
the fact that Tahiti, for instance, has Sirius as a zenith star passing directly overhead, and the notion that Polynesian cultures tend to be chief-based, and the chief of that island is not likely to give up his chiefdom, if you will, easily. So his sons, basically, are either going to have to wait for him to die or find their own island to be a chief of. And so noticing that there are other bright stars, first and second magnitude stars in the sky, well, there must be an island under that one. And probably hundreds, thousands of aspiring chiefs took off on their canoes. Most of them did not find an island, and they are dead. The ones that return from an island are the winners in that competition, like the first one that made it to Hawaii, settled, fed their people, made their crops, made provisions enough on that canoe to sail back to Tahiti to bring up more, if you will, population, more men and women, breeding stock to populate that island.
Yeah. Going back into the chat, Andy asked about, are there any requests to non-natives about how this information is shared and what is told? Andy, do you want to expand on that a little bit? The chair of our committee on such things.
Well, yeah, I mean, I know there's some cultures where you can only tell some stories at a certain time of year or that, and I understand you're dealing with several cultures, since they're from different areas. So just kind of wondering what the native or indigenous people's attitudes are towards the sharing of these techniques.
Yeah, so as far as I know, there's not restrictions on when like what times of year this knowledge can be shared, or things like that. I have been given permission from the navigators that I work with to, we do the show every day at our museum, and our museum has a reputation, like I mentioned our mission earlier, of perpetuating culture and it's a lot of words. Who even memorizes their mission statements? But perpetuating Pacific Island culture and in Hawaii and stuff like that. And this is a way to do that. And so Hawaii is a little bit different than some mainland areas where there's not an organized tribal group with specific elders who you go to. There's many different teachers of different skills. So hula has different lineages of teachers of kumu. Weaving has the similar thing, or navigating as well. And so, you go to these folks and kind of that's where it comes from, I guess. I think as far as it goes, like for other planetarians kind of sharing this knowledge, I don't think that there's any restrictions on that. I think it's definitely something to be aware of, and the context is important. So, like with anything, balancing the way that you talk about it in comparison to what people might be more familiar with Western astronomy frameworks is really, really important. So it's not presenting them as equals. Yeah. So like, this is the way that one culture sees it. This is the way another culture sees it. We're looking at the same skies. Some people saw this as a scorpion. There were not scorpions in this part of the world, so they see it as a fishhook. And not, one is not better than the other, but they just both are. But yeah, it's an interesting question to consider about whether or not it's okay to share this knowledge. And for this subset of what I've shared specifically, it's all out there on the internet anyway with Polynesian Voyaging Society.
Excuse me, the PVS, Polynesian Voyaging Society, has an extensive website and tons of publications and things that they're sharing with educators and students and the general public, especially as they did their around the world sale some years back. They produced, along with Mission Museum and a lot of other institutions, University of Hawaii, tons of curriculum materials from elementary schools all the way up into the university level. Their mission is education. Their number one audience is Native Hawaiians. Their number two audience is everybody else. And so they are, as far as I could ever tell, sharing everything that they know and everything that they're guessing about. They clearly make it clear that they're guessing at those things, because there is no written record of how the original navigators worked. But what we know is what we're doing today, and that's freely shared and encouraged to share. If you would want to contact any of the members of the PVS, I'm sure that their website has a contact us sort of a thing. You can quite likely get in touch with one of the navigators that have been trained to do this sort of work. And all of them that I've ever encountered have been more than generous with their time and information that they want to share with, especially with kids. Student audiences eat this stuff up. It's a compelling story, and it teaches a lot of science and a lot of culture along the way.
Yeah, I'm also curious, Tony, obviously you're focusing on the astronomy related stuff, but how much of the other multisensory things, because that makes it a much more holistic activity, right? So how much of that do you touch upon in the planetarium presentations?
Yeah, so the Wayfinders film touches on a lot of that. So it tells the story of like introduces people, like the spreading of people through the Pacific, and then it talks about Polynesian Voyaging Society's start and some of the other things that are necessary to navigate. It does kind of focus mostly on the stars, but it does definitely touch on those other pieces too. Sometimes I joke with my audiences that, okay, and now we're going to flood the planetarium. We're going to feel the currents. And, so that kind of acknowledging that there's a lot more to this, and that it's not just, this is the way to do it. There's many different ways. Yeah.
We don't have a hard and fast limit on the time for these things. And I think there is one more question, but before and some people are going to be leaving, but before people start leaving, I have a chat poll that I want to do. Okay, if you don't mind. We're thinking of moving the time for these planetarium Zoom seminars to the morning for some of them. And I just wondered, I want to ask if you're, for those people who are still here, and actually we have a pretty big crowd of people here, would it be a problem for you attending in the morning? That's this is not a yes or no question, really, because I might want to ask if you would put what are good times, and let's assume that it's Friday for the time being. What is a good time that you think that these are, and would it be a problem to have it in the morning, like at 10 a.m. or 9:30 or 11? So if you could put in the chat what your reaction to that question, it'd be very helpful. And while you're doing that, we can go to the last question, I think. Did you see that one? Amy asked, is there anything in the genetic or archaeological record that suggests Polynesians landing in South America?
Yes. So there's somebody else, who was it? Oh yeah, John said that the Polynesian word for yam is similar to the Quechua word as well. An article in Smithsonian says the DNA evidence suggests yams originated in the Pacific and were spread by Polynesians. Yeah, so there's evidence like that, where sweet potatoes throughout are grown throughout Polynesia and also in South America. I had actually heard it where they originated in South America and then spread through the Pacific by Polynesians, but that might be I might be remembering that wrong. But that's one of the ways that archaeologists today have been able to kind of trace how people populated the Pacific by looking at the way that like food had spread, as well as language. So mentioning the word is really important. So the word for sweet potato is, I forget what it is. It's uala in Hawaii, but I don't remember what it is in other places, but they're all really pretty similar. So by tracking language, as well as like the way that plants move, not the way that plants move, but like, people take plants with them and other stuff, then they can kind of figure out that way too. So there's a lot of different pieces to that puzzle that get put together. So hopefully that answered the question.
Some of the early archaeology and anthropology blends that talked about the lithic sourcing, the rocks that make adzes, that make canoes and that sort of thing. They were able to track the rocks around the Pacific and find that Mauna Kea, Hawaiian rocks, were being used all throughout the Polynesian Triangle, down into New Zealand, out to Easter Island and such. And when you get as far as Easter Island, it's not that much of a big step out to South America. There's genetic evidence in descendants in the Pacific Northwest that links them to Polynesians. And so it's quite likely that these, fantastically able voyagers voyaged well beyond the Polynesian Triangle back into Asia and out to the Americas as well. But there's not a lot of hard evidence outside of some of the genetics in the Pacific Northwest that I'm aware of. Tony, there may be more stuff going on now.
Yeah, I mean, it's always constantly changing. There's a renovation of one of the halls in our museum that was a couple of years ago now, and they finished putting it all up, and then new archaeological evidence and other things came out, and it was already wrong and out of date. So it's constantly changing. As far as the DNA evidence and things like that goes, it's a very touchy subject, especially among indigenous populations. So it's not something I think that is really, in my opinion, the best way to try to go about it, because there's a lot of slippery slopes to bad things that can happen with that. And, you know, these are populations of people who have been really, trying to think of a nice way to say it. I'm just going to say shit upon for a very long time. And so, you know, we have to be very careful with both how we talk about these things, but also how we interact with those populations too. So anyway, there was a great article in the Planetarium from December that talked about working with indigenous populations that I encourage all of you to go check out if you didn't already see it.
So Tony, can you talk about how long these voyages lasted? And, you know, what evidence they had of, you know, supplies like bringing yams, or, you know, did they just, you know, rely on catching fish or what have you? I'm sure most of it's speculation, but.
Yeah, so the voyages that they take now, it took 32 or 34 days, the first voyage with Hokulea. And today, I think the shortest time that it's taken, sorry, and that's to go to Tahiti. So the shortest time I think that they've gotten to Tahiti is like 3.5 weeks or something like that. So you have to have really favorable winds, especially as you go through the equatorial regions around where you find the doldrums, and places where there's not a whole lot of wind. So that first time that they went, I know that they were stuck for about a week without being able to move because there was just no wind at all. And then you get, you know, little breezes here and there that just slowly move you along. But yeah, somewhere from Hawaii to Tahiti, which is about 2,500 miles, is about a month. As far as how they go, like longer voyages, you know, fishing is obviously a great way to be able to do that. Today they will take supplies and things with them, and they have somebody on board who is the designated cook, and that's like all that they're able to do. And some of that, you know, they're cooking the things that they brought with them, but they're trying to catch fish along the way as much as they can, to not have to dig into their other food stocks too much to go along. But yeah, you prepare for as long as you think you're going to be gone, and then you go with that. So you're taking along plants with you, and animals, especially if you're looking to, you're expecting to find a new place. Then pigs and dogs and chickens were three of the, you know, animals that were taken and spread throughout the Pacific really well. And then rats going along with people as well, as some of the different plants. So like coconuts and taro and sugarcane, like a bunch of other things that are what are called canoe plants, because they're things that were taken island to island by the canoes. They didn't spread naturally. So some things did spread naturally on the with birds flying or on winds and waves, but it takes stuff with them too.
It's interesting talking about the rats. On one of the voyages coming back up from Tahiti back to the Big Island, the Hokulea was held offshore from Hilo, Hawaii, for I think it was like 4 or 5 days, because the crew discovered that they were carrying no-no flies, tiny little gnats, biting gnats that lived on Tahiti, but had not been introduced to Hawaii. You can imagine that was in the 1990s somewhere, I suppose. You can imagine what came with those canoes back when. Who knows, maybe that's how Hawaii got mosquitoes and such. But nowadays, of course, they've got to be much, much more careful to bring in non-indigenous plants or animals. They fumigated the canoe. It was okay.
So those of you who came in very late, we had a sign in at the beginning where we put our name. If you didn't sign in, just you write your name and where you're from. And this whole thing is recorded. So if you came in very late, you'll be able to go back to the recording to see what you missed.
Sign in here in the chat or where?
In the chat.
Paige, I didn't know that you're on Hawaii. Hello, neighbor.
Okay, well, we're pretty close to calling it a wrap, I think. And I
Yeah.
want to, again, Tony, that was amazing. That was an excellent thing. Another round of applause for Tony.
Here.
And a thank you to all of you who came. It's always, the people who come who make the event and make it the experience. And of course, all the people who are going to watch the recording. So
Yeah, thank you to everybody watching the recording as well. I should have said that at the beginning. As somebody who watches a lot of recordings due to time zones.
And I have to put in a plug for my favorite song, Kimo Kahawano's "It's Aloha Friday." If you have an Alexa device, just tell it to play "It's Aloha Friday" and get a feeling for what Friday is like in the islands.
what, you're not going to play it for us?
Okay, Alexa, play "It's Aloha Friday."
I think we won't get in trouble if there's just a few bars.
Oh, now it's telling me I have to subscribe. No, you don't have to. Alexa, try it on your own. I'll keep
Okay.
working on it.
I will. I know I said I was going to work, show some Stellarium stuff, and we had some really good questions. So I'm sorry I missed that. Those things. I have to eat lunch before I have to get back into the dome to do the afternoon show. So I can't stick around much longer. But Rosemary, if you had specific questions about it, we can set up another time if you want.
I think Stellarium would be worthy of a part 2 talk, because this is great stuff. Thanks.
Well, ideally, I would use my full dome, but we have somebody else cover the midday show for me, so it works a lot better over there. I have to kind of fumble through it with Stellarium. I have my scripts written in Digistar, so
Maybe that's where an early time would work. Huh?
yeah, not too early now. Yeah, thank you all very much for attending and for all the great questions. Ken, thank you for all of your input as well, and being put on the spot just a little bit. So.
Just on here, drinking up my beer, got Yankees running everywhere. Got some bookie on the side while mom was trying to hide the Miller and the Heineken. It's Aloha Friday, no work till Monday. It's Aloha Friday, no work till Monday.
This concludes Island Radio. Just ask Alexa for "It's Aloha Friday." You'll get it.
Okay, and then with that, I'm going to stop the recording.